Good afternoon, everyone. This is Andrew Jacoby. Welcome to the Advancing Opportunity Through Affordable Housing webinar. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes, so settle in for the next hour. Everyone, this is Andrew Jacoby at Enterprise Community Partners. Thank you all for joining our webinar today. I am the Vice President for Policy Development at Enterprise Community Partners. Our research team under the Policy Development and Research umbrella provides both thought leadership and data-backed recommendations to influence housing and community development policy. We try to address both emerging policy issues and long-term needs. We've got a number of research items underway. We're doing a lot of work around expanding the supply of affordable housing, strategies for preserving existing affordable housing, understanding the impact of low-income housing tax credit development on communities, and more broadly, understanding and measuring and addressing neighborhood change, as well as studying affordability in the context of resilience and recovery. And you'll see that the paper that we're presenting today is somewhat cross-cutting around some of those issues, and we're really very, very pleased to be partnering with the Housing Partnership Network around launching this series of white papers called Advancing Opportunity Through Affordable Housing, with contributions from the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California at Berkeley. The series focuses on accelerating promising ideas to address longstanding community development challenges in the current environment. And so we're excited to spend the next hour sharing the background on these papers with you, sharing some key takeaways and answering your questions. And we do want to hear from you. And if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please use the WebEx feature at the bottom right of the browser to send any questions in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can over the course of this conversation. And let's briefly hear from our co-authors. So Chris, over to you.
Hello, I'm Kristin Stickle, and I'm Vice President of Policy and Partnership at the National Community Stabilization Trust. We're a national nonprofit that transfers foreclosed properties to responsible owners and advocates on the policy issues affecting homeownership in disinvested neighborhoods. Prior to that, I worked at Housing Partnership Network, an alliance of high-performing nonprofits that develops and rebuilds and builds affordable housing. The work of HPN members that redevelop single-family homes in distressed neighborhoods was what inspired me to write Supporting Neighborhoods Left Behind when I was at HPN.
Great. And Elizabeth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, this is Elizabeth Kneebone. I'm the Research Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. At the Turner Center, we do policy and research work focused on housing issues across the country and here in California, looking at supply? How do we more affordably and scale up the kinds of supply we need to meet the price pressures that are being felt in markets across the country? Thinking about issues of access, both to who can access affordable ownership and who has access through housing to areas of opportunity. And we also work on the intersection of environmental sustainability and housing to think about how we can integrate those goals of resilience and sustainability over the long term.
Great. Thanks, both of you. And so this white paper series and this webinar is focused on advancing opportunity through affordable housing. The papers address some longstanding challenges surrounding community development in today's environment. So before we dive into the papers, let's ground the discussion. Chris, tossing it to you first, but Elizabeth, definitely feel free to weigh in. How would you define what it means to advance opportunity through affordable housing?
What I focused on in my paper is a problem in the housing market that's less well known than the soaring rents in cities like Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. The problem I'm focusing on is the other housing crisis that demands attention. It's pockets of blight and disinvestment that have persisted in urban and rural areas after the Great Recession. I refer them to as neighborhoods left behind. They're places where low property values make it difficult to access credit to maintain or purchase homes. One key problem with this is then with these neighborhoods with vacancy and blight, it costs more to build or rehabilitate a home or commercial property than the building can be sold for. This so-called value gap is a big barrier to the return to a functioning real estate market in these places, thus having a terrible impact on the wealth building potential of homeownership in these communities. So it makes it far more difficult for the residents to build assets.
Yeah, I think to Chris's point, when I think about advancing opportunity through housing and through affordable housing, I feel like we have an increasing understanding of how where you live makes a difference on what the sorts of opportunities and barriers you might face to economic stability, economic mobility over time, whether that's in disinvested, distressed neighborhoods that may have been left behind, the ones that Chris really focused on, or thinking about how do we increase more access to areas of opportunity that we know provide really important platforms and opportunities for upward mobility, particularly for low-income families. As we think about that landscape and how neighborhood matters, housing is really at the foundation of that. This is this foundational platform for how we think about building economic success, particularly for disadvantaged and low-income households and communities. And really, I think with this series and hopefully this conversation today is thinking about how do we leverage federal programs as effectively as possible to lay that groundwork? How do we really set those building blocks in place to allow families and communities to thrive?
That's exactly right, Elizabeth. Yeah. At a conference last week, I heard housing referred to as the individual platform, the invisible platform for individual and community success. And I think that's a good way to think about it. It's an invisible platform, but it's absolutely critical to both neighborhoods and individuals.
Yeah, and I think that sort of, I think one of the challenges and one of the things I think we're trying to do here is sort of make it from invisible to visible and really raise up some of the challenges that exist in the existing housing stock, both in terms of individual properties and neighborhoods that have a lot of blight, and then certainly in our paper, the need for investment in public housing, which has long been sort of left behind as well in a lot of ways. But also thinking about the residents and sort of the ability to kind of improve both community outcomes and individual outcomes at the same time. So I think that's sort of a nice segue to kind of the next sort of framing question that I think we've all been grappling with is some of the challenges that our sector faces. Elizabeth, what would you say that some of the most pressing challenges that we're grappling with might be?
So I think with all that being said and that acknowledgement of the platform that subsidized and affordable housing can play and does play the sort of essential role, it's also understanding how it fits in this broader ecosystem, sort of what we can and can't control through that avenue, through these programs. So when I'm thinking about that, it's especially in higher cost markets like in the Bay Area or DC, we see the subsidized households and subsidized programs can provide the stabilizing opportunity and space for families and for individuals. But when you have a broader market, a broader housing market that is facing price pressures and affordability challenges increasingly up the income distribution, what that can do is really move that next rung of the ladder further away. So as someone may be finding economic stability or may be finding that platform and able to work and bring that sort of self-sufficiency to their family, moving out of subsidy can become that much harder when there's not that next rung in the market for them to achieve. So understanding how that fits into a continuum on the supply side is incredibly important. And even beyond that, and I'm sort of foreshadowing where I'm going with my paper, there's the other side of the equation, whether you're in a high-cost market or in a more distressed or older industrial area that may be struggling economically. What does the employment landscape look like? What kinds of are we setting up a situation where the pieces are connecting together in a way that work can lead you to a self-sufficient outcome without subsidy? That's a housing market thing, but it's also a labor market piece of the puzzle. What sorts of jobs is the economy creating? Where are they located? What does it cost to get to work? And do the wages that you earn in that job set you up to participate in the unsubsidized market? So the subsidized housing piece is so important, and we need to figure out a way to make those subsidies and those programs, work in more places for more people, but also appreciate how they connect to these other levers that really have to be pulled at the same time to advance the kind of opportunity we want to see.
Yeah, I think your point about sort of operating in the unsubsidized space is a really critical one, and I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is it's increasingly difficult to preserve unsubsidized affordable housing, particularly in the multifamily context. That the affordable properties tend to be smaller, tend to be older, and so there are tremendous pressures on just sort of maintaining the quality of those properties, ensuring that they remain habitable, but at the same time, in a lot of neighborhoods, sort of different than the ones that Chris is focused on, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of pressure to the upside for a whole host of reasons, and so the ability to kind of maintain the affordability over the long term of properties that have no restrictions on their use at the end of the day. They're sort of market rate affordable, unsubsidized affordable, different terms for it. That the gap there sort of is being squeezed, either sort of pressure at the top to go higher on rents or pressure on the, sort of from the bottom to just sort of fall out of productive use. And so that, I think, is a real challenge that we're increasingly grappling with in a variety of different ways. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's ironic that it is the low property values, the low prices in the neighborhoods I focused my study on. Actually, intuitively you think, oh, well, it must be much easier for families. Homeownership challenges must not be as large for families because prices are low in those neighborhoods. Actually, the low prices, which are below the cost to renovate a home, thus cause potential homeowners or existing homeowners to be unable to bring the properties to a decent habitable state. So families can't even get on the ladder of opportunity because the low property values cause a lack of access to credit, which has its own series of challenges. So it's important. I think one of the reasons I'm happy with this series of papers is I think that they kind of add some texture and context to our housing challenges. Have a lot of different dimensions, and it's by no means simple.
Great. Now that you've mentioned the papers themselves, why don't we take a few minutes to kind of walk the listeners through the papers, which they may have read already, because I know this is sort of a go-getter group, and certainly really thrilled with so many folks joining for the webinar. But we'll just take a few minutes now. Each of us will walk the listeners through the papers. So each of our papers, as you've heard, kind of addresses the challenges from a slightly different angle. But really, it's all ultimately focused on how we expand opportunity for residents in a variety of different places, right? It's not just about a particular type of neighborhood, a particular type of community. So the paper that I co-authored with my colleague Rachel Drew focuses on the transformation of federally subsidized and public housing. And we, I think, recognize that HUD has an opportunity to both improve the reach and quality of housing assistance nationwide by helping to facilitate the greatest degree of mobility for voucher holders, as well as upgrading the quality of the existing public housing stock in a variety of different ways. So thinking about the sort of stock side of things, the physical infrastructure, before we turn to the residents themselves and the opportunities that they might need, we really sort of tee up a series of questions around programmatic and financial innovation for HUD-subsidized residents and properties to help maximize the efficacy of the existing HUD programs, as well as improving resident outcomes and ensuring the long-term viability of the subsidized property. So thinking about the physical infrastructure side of things, really thinking about eliminating the cap on the RAD conversions, the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. There is currently a cap of about 455,000 units, and the expectation, given the trajectory and the volume of applications for the program, is that the cap will be exceeded by the middle of next year. And this has really been a critical way in which traditional public housing has been able to be converted into project-based vouchers and project-based rental assistance contracts, allowing those properties to bring in additional sources of funding and additional public as well as private resources through things like the low-income housing tax credit, private mortgage debt, and other sources of capital, including home dollars, community development block grants, and other gap financing to really make these buildings and these communities viable over the long term. And so in that context, we recognize that there may be questions as to how beneficial it has been to residents. It's been a question that's been asked a lot of times, and we're starting to see some findings in terms of the rates of return and things like that. And there are other ways to really ensure that everybody who wants to return to a community that's gone through a RAD transformation can do it in a way that's beneficial to all involved. And then sort of understanding which types of properties have been most appropriate for applying the RAD program to them. And then sort of as a corollary, thinking about identifying additional sources of capital for public housing renovation. We know that the capital backlog is tremendous. It's at about $26 billion. It's growing at a rate of about $3.4 billion per year. So it's a tremendous amount of money that's needed, but also there's a really important legacy of these properties, and to sort of just let them go and to lose them would be a tremendous loss. So are there ways in which programs can be tweaked to make streamlining some of the renovations necessary to gain access to external funding sources can be improved? And then also thinking about it not only on the capital side, but also operationally, are there ways to sort of better tweak some of the rent information that fair market rents can be
rents in cities like Washington, D.C.
that public housing agencies might also be more flexible in meeting the need to both cover the cost, but also making sure that they remain accessible for their residents. And then flipping to the resident side of things, really thinking about increasing housing choice voucher utilization. Quite often, public housing agencies will commit vouchers knowing that many recipients will, in fact, ultimately return them because they can't find a suitable living unit in the time allotted. And
pockets of blight and
that people who finally win the lottery, because we know that only about 1 in 4 people who are eligible for assistance actually get the assistance that they need. It's not an entitlement program, unlike other social safety net programs, but making sure that people who get vouchers are actually able to have them deployed and can use it to find safe and decent housing in communities of their choice. And that leads into the last point that we make, is really about expanding the portability of housing assistance and increasing mobility for residents. Part of that is also about not limiting them to the current jurisdiction where the voucher happens to have been issued, but really becoming more flexible about taking it across a region to allow folks to be able to move to where the jobs might be, to where better schools might be. And so thinking about it from that perspective, are there ways in which the overall program rules can be improved to expand portability, also thinking about so potentially expanding a mobility demonstration program that was finally approved in the fiscal year 2019 budget, and really thinking about ways that we help people get into appropriate housing for their circumstances, not only where they currently, sort of in the circumstances in which they currently find themselves, but more aspirationally moving them to places where there are more opportunities.
Left behind. There are places where
better meeting their longer-term life goals. So just sort of very quickly, to kind of summarize, thinking about investing in people and places, we make the argument that federal programs should eliminate the cap on rental assistance demonstration conversions, identifying additional sources of capital to finance those renovations. We think, as we've just said, to make it easier for voucher holders to successfully use those vouchers to rent a home, and to make it easier for voucher holders to keep their vouchers when moving to new places with greater opportunity. And so with that, I am happy to turn it over to Kris Stickle to share her summary of her paper.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me advance the slide. Credit to maintain. I've been saying before, I looked at a different problem, which is the problem of neighborhoods left behind. And here's this slide has gives some sort of color to the problem I'm talking about. Only 27% of the homes in the United States that sold for less than $70,000 had a mortgage. And so what that means is most of the homes were bought by cash investors who are either landlords or speculators. That's very bad for neighborhoods and for homeownership in those neighborhoods, because the lack of mortgages means that homeowners who are going to live in the homes can't purchase them, and instead it tends to build wealth outside of the neighborhood in the hands of landlords or speculators who aren't necessarily concerned about the overall health of the neighborhood. And so related to the problem of lack of access to credit is this problem of what I had referred to earlier, which is called the value gap. And that is that in neighborhoods with vacancy and blight, it costs more to build or rehabilitate a home or commercial property than the building can be sold for. And so this is a big barrier to the return of a functioning real estate market. In most cases, financial institutions cannot lend more than a property is worth, and thus in neighborhoods with depressed markets, there are few loans made to buy or renovate properties. In cities with strong real estate markets, vacant properties are quickly purchased. This doesn't happen in the neighborhoods left behind, and the vacancies lead to a downward spiral of spreading blight. And I think that you can. And in some cases, it's the entire market that's suffering from disinvestment. Many of the kind of iconic post-industrial cities in the heartland of the United States fall into this category. But in other cases, you've got cities that have some neighborhoods with strong rental markets with rising rents, displacement of longtime residents, coexisting with struggling communities where property values don't support renovations. So like Chicago, potential of her. So sometimes the problem of neighborhoods left behind comprises just one part of an overall city with a strong market like a Chicago or Atlanta. And the supporting neighborhoods left behind paper came out of the work of housing partnership members who work in Chicago, Atlanta, and other cities. But the good news is really something can be done about this. So the paper makes recommendations in 4 different categories. The first is to fill this value gap. So if a house costs $130,000 to renovate or purchase, but the market value is only $100,000, that value gap is not the entire cost of the property. It's just that valuation gap. Housing Partnership Network, the National Community Stabilization Trust, and others are part of a broad-based coalition working on legislation which solves this problem by creating a program administered by state housing finance agencies that gives tax credits to investors that fill the valuation gap, thus helping jumpstart the mortgage market in distressed communities. So all the information is available at the URL on this slide, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. I encourage you to take a look at it because it has it's a very carefully crafted proposal to help start or thinking about market and communities that need the investment. Of course, the next problem that the paper addresses is improving access to mortgage debt for sustainable homeownership. As you saw on the earlier slide, most small dollar mortgages, most homes that are sold don't have mortgages. And that's a problem because that discourages homeowners from buying these homes. So the paper makes recommendations of changes in the secondary market with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should be encouraged to buy low-value mortgages, and the Federal Housing Administration, which guarantees mortgages, can improve its renovation mortgage product to encourage more lending in this space. Of course, another recommendation we make is another solution to the challenge of weak markets is to convert houses to rental properties until the market strengthens. This requires competent, mission-driven landlords like Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership or CHN Housing Partners in Cleveland, and these are the entities that can do a good job managing real estate as rental housing until the market returns. And then the last recommendation suggests that the federal government help local governments with demolition of obsolete properties. There are some cities where the overhang of vacant, distressed properties on the market is so large that it discourages real estate activity throughout the entire city. Alan Malik of the Center for Community Progress has coined the term hypervacancy. To talk last week, I heard housing numbers of vacant lots and vacant buildings. And so just as the federal government shares the cost of building roads, bridges, sewers, airports, and other kinds of infrastructure with localities, it makes sense for federal assistance to communities that need assistance to demolish obsolete structures to receive federal assistance as well. So if Congress addresses our infrastructure needs, this is an additional matter that should be included. Because with the right mix of these properties with the value gap, access to credit, and funding for demolition, many of these markets could much more successfully connect families to the ladder of opportunity that is homeownership. And now over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Chris. I think that is a really nice segue into talking about my contribution to the series, because it's such a reminder about how variable local market conditions can be, and how from even within the same region or the same market, you can have very different neighborhood realities at its foundation, right, which really affects how we think about pulling these different levers and trying to advance opportunity in all kinds of different places. And really the impetus for this paper, the employment landscape for subsidized households, really came about after the president signed an executive order reducing poverty in America by promoting opportunity and economic mobility. And these are phrases and words that we really hear a lot about these days, because I think we do understand the importance of place through decades worth of research. Most recently, Raj Chetty and his colleagues pointing out the importance of place and sort of creating that platform. And obviously, housing is central to that. But in this time of longest economic expansion on record, sustained low unemployment rates, there's an importance to disaggregating the national statistics to really understand how things like work requirements can go to ground in different places. Because though the national statistics tell us one story, one indicator of how the economy is going, that plays out very differently from place to place once you start to dig into different parts of the country and even different neighborhoods within different regions. So the impetus of this paper, I think, is particularly important, not just about this call for work requirements and advancing work-focused programs was for all sorts of federal support programs, but I think it's particularly important to think about that local environment in the context of subsidized households because they are very restricted. As Andrew was pointing out in his remarks, the choice about where to live is very restricted by nature of many of these programs. If you have a public housing unit subsidy, that subsidy is tied to a particular unit, to a particular place. And even voucher holders, which have a bit more flexibility in how they use
pressing challenges that we're grappling with might
think about where they're actually able to find affordable rental properties where they can actually use that voucher. So understanding that landscape around subsidized households is critical to getting these sorts of economic mobility targets right. And what we see and what you see sort of in this infographic helps kind of paint that picture, which when you look at public housing in particular, this paper looked across a number of different subsidized programs, but for one example, the majority of residents in public housing units live in a county that has higher than average unemployment rates. As we begin to disaggregate, we see that this landscape is not even, and these households are not arrayed evenly across these different types of markets and places. You see that as well when you go down to the neighborhood level. For the nation as a whole, 1 in 4 households live in a high poverty neighborhood. That is a neighborhood with a 20% poverty rate or more, and that 20% poverty rate matters because research has shown that's the threshold at which we start to see the negative effects of concentrated poverty emerge. So of all households in the country, 1 in 4 live in that kind of neighborhood. When you look at subsidized households, that figure more than doubles. And in fact, it's more than 3/4 of public housing units that are in high poverty neighborhoods. So where these households are located, they tend to be clustered in these higher poverty, lower opportunity communities. And the same is true of poor residents overall. You know, ideally, if we were looking at employment conditions among subsidized households, we would have publicly available data that could allow us to see their commute patterns, could allow us to see the employment patterns. Because we don't have that sort of data available, what we can see are the types of neighborhoods these households live in, and they tend to look very similar to the neighborhoods that poor renters overall, unsubsidized renters live in as well, because of where this lower cost rental housing tends to cluster within major metro areas, which is in these higher poverty neighborhoods. And what we see, and the sort of final point on the infographic is when you start to look at employment patterns within these high poverty neighborhoods, it's not that they look very different overall in terms of work. You know, the majority of these households have, the vast majority of these, when I'm thinking about that, it's subsidized residents tend to have at least one worker. Most adults in these neighborhoods are working. But when you look at what kinds of work and what sorts of jobs they're working, that's where we see more of a divergence with the overall averages and statistics overall. What you see is that they especially be working jobs that don't require a BA. They're less likely to have a bachelor's degree. They're more likely to be working jobs that don't require a college degree, and the wage levels tend to be lower on average in these neighborhoods where subsidized households live. So they're working, but they're not working jobs that pay very well. And that matters when we think about what is the platform for mobility and where they might be able to move without subsidy. Is the jobs that they're yes, a lot of people are working, unemployment is very low, but that doesn't mean they're quality jobs that are paying wages that allow you to move in the private market. The other thing we see, and again, this is where the infographic stops, but the paper goes on to create, to put a lot more metrics and data around the employment patterns and how where you live makes a difference. So for instance, if you look at the number of jobs near the typical subsidized household or voucher household in a big city across the United States, and again, we've pulled data for the whole country. If you look at the neighborhoods that voucher holders in cities tend to live in, they are near 2.5 times as many jobs as their counterpart in the suburbs. They are near 47 times more jobs than the typical subsidized or voucher holder in a rural community. So that where you live obviously makes a difference for the proximity to employment. Now, proximity isn't everything. These workers still have to compete, and they're competing with a lot more people to get those jobs. Also, the kinds of jobs matter. If you look in urban areas, the big cities that subsidized households, those neighborhoods they tend to live in, the jobs around them, the majority of those jobs require a college degree. So they may not have the skill sets needed to compete, and they're competing against a lot more people because of that proximity. However, the proximity also matters because, again, when you think about how that proximity diminishes so drastically as you move away from urban cores, that raises other challenges like the need to drive. Commute distances really lengthen as you move away from the urban core. We also see the dependence on cars becoming that much more important. The challenge is that the neighborhoods in which subsidized households tend to live are also neighborhoods that have lower car ownership rates, and that's particularly true among unemployed households. Even in rural communities where, having a car is so important, the typical public housing resident lives in a neighborhood where 1 in 4 unemployed households doesn't have a car. So when you think about the kinds of barriers that can come about just by the nature of where you live, how strong is the employment market in which you're located, but when you have a broad market, do you have jobs nearby? What do your commute patterns look like? That all depends on your ability to gain and keep stable employment and the kinds of employment and pathways that can help lead a family to self-sufficiency and eventually away from subsidy. So the real upshot of this study is not that work-focused programs can't work, but that it takes a lot to get them right. And, Charlotte has often held up as an example for the experiments they're doing around work requirements and the success, the evaluations of that program have that is to be working. But the head of Meacham Fulton, who's the head of the Charlotte Housing Authority, to paraphrase him, has essentially said, just asking someone to get a job isn't enough. They need the supports in place to help that work, right? So what we know, if we're going to think about federal programs, is that just imposing work requirements is not likely to be an effective program to truly advance opportunity for these families. Again, housing is a really necessary stabilizing platform, but how do we make sure then there really are the supports in place to allow families, help families use that platform as a path to stability and eventual mobility? We know, because there are programs that have been evaluated, what is important to making these sorts of work-focused programs work, whether they're requirements or just programs that are built to support work efforts and employment outcomes. So whether you're looking at the Charlotte model or something like the Jobs Plus demonstration, the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, there are also really strong nonprofits who have built work-focused programs that have shown really positive outcomes, like Community Builders, like Common Bond Communities. And in the paper details each of these sorts of examples in more detail. But I think what is so striking is the commonality across any program that has been shown to have success in either increasing employment rates or earned incomes of people who are already working, is that they, again, it's not just the work itself, it's that they have typically trained staff, a case manager, the sort of backbone supports in place to make sure that that work goal is within the context of that local labor market. Are we addressing things like transportation challenges or child care challenges or other things, other kinds of work supports that need to be in place to really help someone be successful in finding and keeping employment? I think with those sorts of, and that's the other piece of it too, is they have that backbone, that case manager who can help troubleshoot and triage and goal set with these workers and residents. But then there's also this array of the safety net support programs around them that are coordinated with the housing program to make these work-focused outcomes successful. So I think that really points the way to being able to use evidence-based strategies and figuring out ways to scale those up. How do we scale up what we know is working? Some of that means investing in more evidence building, right? Really evaluating and understanding in what kinds of markets, for what kinds of residents. Moving out of subsidy can become that cycle. Do these programs actually work the best, and are they the most effective? And then really investing in the infrastructure. Again, it's not enough to just say you have to get a job. How do we make sure that these programs have the right backbone support, that staff capacity that's so essential to making them successful? How can the federal government be investing in that capacity building to scale up what is working in more places? And that scaling up what is working in more places, again, the common theme here is recognizing the variability in local labor market conditions and level setting accordingly. Again, to return to that Charlotte example, Meacham Fulton has also been very eloquent on the point of it's not just the job, it's the supports that go with the job. And also, even people doing things, all the right things, may not be earning enough to get into private market housing. So how do we make sure we're level setting accordingly in that broader market conditions so that we can make sure we're setting these families up for long-term success and don't inadvertently set the stage for stripping them of these really critical supports that play such a stabilizing influence for so many families and residents. And with that, I would love to turn it back to Andrew so we continue on the supply side.
Great. Yeah. So before we do that, for for everyone, just want to do a quick lightning round of some key takeaways. So I'm going to kind of build actually off of Elizabeth where you ended. Is really thinking about increasing sort of flexibility in the existing program. So it's not only that we're providing the supports to the individuals and to the families to make sure that they're able to make good choices, but that there are no sort of structural barriers to being able to execute on those choices. Thinking about that from the mobility perspective, but also thinking about, again, the need for investment in the physical infrastructure of the existing public housing stock, and thinking about flexibilities there and sort of being creative to some degree about bringing in new revenue sources or subsidy sources to make the long-term investment in the existing properties better and feasible, which can also then sort of upgrade the quality of the existing neighborhoods where we already see, sort of existing high poverty rates. You talked about, kind of that 20% tipping point. And so thinking about ways in which we potentially draw in new residents in a way that sort of maintains a vitality to the community and recognizes the existing community assets and not necessarily just sort of give away, sort of pass on opportunities to reinvest in public housing sites. And then potentially leading to displacement of folks. So thinking about, again, sort of the expansion of RAD, as well as identifying additional sources of funding and capital streams to make broader investment in public housing. Chris, any thoughts or last sort of takeaways that you'd like to ask of folks?
Well, I would invite people to really think about how blight and vacancy can spread without the right interventions because of the structural issues that are discussed in the paper with the valuation gap and lack of low-value mortgage lending. But consider how cost-effective it is to improve the built environment we already have, as Andrew was talking about with public housing. Over the years, the National Community Stabilization Trust has found that the foreclosed homes that we transfer in low-value markets usually need about $20,000 per house in repairs. That's really not an enormous sum to stabilize communities and keep people in their homes and, help preserve that asset for that family. And I would really invite people to think about the cost effectiveness and the environmental benefits of protecting the infrastructure we already have and making it work for families.
Great. Elizabeth, any thoughts before we move to the Q&A?
Yeah, I feel like those dual themes have sort of run throughout all of our comments around the importance of both investing, using these dollars strategically to invest in distressed or disinvested places where they can really make a difference for bringing opportunity into these communities or stabilizing these communities. At the same time, thinking about how these programs are opening up opportunities in other already sort of strong communities that could really benefit lower income families if they had more access to those places. So it's like the both and of those strategies and how important doing that at the right scale is to make sure we're reaching more families, right, that could benefit from these strategies. And I guess the biggest takeaway for me from all of this is something Escape alluded to earlier, is resist overly simplistic solutions, right? Anything that sounds too good to be true for how simple it is probably not really engaging with the nuance of these very complex situations. So again, thinking about this from advancing an opportunity perspective, clearly housing and work go hand in hand in that scenario. But there's so many things that come into play that can either help or hinder a family on their way to economic stability and advancement within the context of their local communities. So being able to hold those things in that bigger context as we align the different supports available to these families and communities is critical to truly have long-term impact moving forward.
Great. So we will now move to the Q&A section of the presentations. We've got about 15 minutes left. So a couple of just sort of technical things. So if you look at your WebEx interface, I guess, you can drop questions in on the bottom right under the Q&A, and just a couple of logistical things while we're waiting for questions to come in. The papers themselves, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint that we've shared this afternoon, and a recording of the webinar, if you want to go back and listen to it, or sort of go exercise and jog to it as a podcast or something like that, they'll all be available on the website that's hosting all of the papers, which is at www.enterprisecommunity.org/advancing opportunity through affordable housing. That last phrase, right, advancing opportunity through affordable housing, is linked with hyphens. So it's enterprisecommunity.org/advancing opportunity through affordable housing. Sort of a mouthful, but the point of that is to give you guys all time to type in questions into the Q&A box. But those will all be available there. The PowerPoint should go up shortly, and the papers themselves are already available for download. So with that, seeing that we've got a number of questions, someone asked, had a comment that entitlement communities receive community development block grant funds that can be used for demolition of vacant distressed properties. And so the question that this person is asking is, does there need to be more of a conversation with entitlement communities about adopting a policy or creating a CDBG program to address blighted properties? Chris, that seems straight up in your wheelhouse, so I'll let you take that one.
Okay, that's a terrific question. Thank you very much. And I think that the answer is that CDBG can be used for a very wide variety of purposes, and in recent years, the amount of CDBG appropriated by Congress has been ratcheting down a bit, and the money is very hotly competed for locally. It's used for a whole broad array of purposes. So I do think that it's very timely and appropriate to ask, don't cities need something else? These cities who have this problem with concentrated blight and vacancy, like a Baltimore or a Cleveland, don't those localities need something else to help them with the scale of the demolition? So I've actually been doing some work talking to congressional offices. There is some member interest in this issue. Plus, you also need, to complement the demolition strategy with a strategy to drive investment into neighborhoods where people are still living. That is the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is the tax credit I talked about that would fill the value gap so that the market can work, so that the person buying the house can get a mortgage, because the value gap is filled by the tax credit that would be administered by the states. And that piece of legislation is H.R. 3316, and if you're interested in the proposal, go to Neighborhood Homes Investment Act.org, and take a look at the proposal, and if you're interested, you can endorse it or encourage your member of Congress to support it. Because, these markets don't need just one thing. They need a variety of tools, and the current tools are overtaxed. taxed. The problems is larger than what the existing funding streams accommodate.
Great. Elizabeth, any thoughts on that?
No, I will leave it at that. Work in more places.
But while Chris is still on the hot seat, question came in. Can you expand on strategies to encourage nonprofits to enter the single-family rental market? And I will toss in sort of, I guess, moderator's prerogative. Is it a good idea? And under what circumstances should nonprofits come in to enter the single-family rental market? That topic near and dear to my heart as well.
It's a great topic. It's near and dear to the heart of both the National Community Stabilization Trust, where I work now, and my prior employer, Housing Partnership Network. I think it's really important to think about the housing stock in the United States, because according to the American Housing Survey, there's 135 million housing units in the United States. Of those, 101 million of them are in buildings with 1 to 4 units. So that is either a single-family house or the kind of duplex houses or triplexes like in Boston. Most of the housing stock in the U.S. that's already been built is in that form. So it seems it would defy credulity to me that we could solve our affordable housing challenges, which, as we've been talking about on this webinar, that have multiple dimensions, without addressing the largest source of housing stock in our country, which is single-family houses. And different nonprofits across the country are doing all sorts of creative, thoughtful things to either manage single-family homes as quality rentals, or working with homeowners to and housing counseling agencies to create new homeowners. And it doesn't seem, given the difficulties with NIMBY, we definitely need more housing, and multifamily housing has an important place. But it seems like a mistake to neglect the vast bulk of the housing stock for environmental reasons, cost-effectiveness reasons. It seems to me you need to start there. And I think nonprofits like the ones profiled, look at in the appendix of the paper, there's profiles of nonprofits like HPI Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky, or the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership in Atlanta, or CHN Housing Partners in Cleveland, that are doing terrific work to improve the single-family housing stock in their cities. The other thing is most of the United States is zoned for single-family housing too. So it seems like to solve a problem, you go where it is. And that's with the single-family stock.
I want to just pitch in on that too, because I think, I will also plug, I have another paper coming out in the next week that looks specifically at this issue in the 100 largest metro areas. And, you're right, the single-family, even not just existing housing stock, it's been the bulk of what we've built. Single-family detached has been the bulk of what has been built across the major metro areas in the last 20, 30 years. So it is a dominant part of our built environment in most across the metropolitan landscape. And what we've seen, especially since the foreclosure crisis, is the rapid increase in the number of not affordable, but the number of single-family rentals on the market. And in this new paper, we take a look at where those are. And, the more concentrated those single-family rentals are within a neighborhood, the more likely that neighborhood is to be one of higher poverty and more distress. So if anything, that point about nonprofit operators being able to ensure that this is, again, a stabilizing platform, and think about this in a broader community development context, rather than just a sort of concentration on the private market where those interests may not be at the fore, suggests to me that there's a real opportunity for nonprofits to play an important role in that space, again, to make sure that we're not seeing new concentrations of poverty emerge, which we already have beyond the urban core, but really thinking about how we can create more stable mixed income neighborhoods, of which single-family rentals are a piece of the puzzle.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just add in as well. We've done a lot of research around small multifamily, and we've kind of defined that category as everything from 2 units and above, and it's sort of just worth calling out for folks on the webinar, just so they understand that the plurality of rental properties in this country are actually in small buildings. That when you include 1 to 4 unit properties as a single category, that's actually the majority of rental homes in this country. And when folks think about rental units, they typically think in most places around large properties with 50 or more units in them, whether that's a high-rise or a garden-style building or things like that. But that's only about 10% of the rental stock overall. And so kind of not incorporating these smaller properties into the conversation about location, about affordability, I think is a real missed opportunity in thinking about the role that nonprofits can play, particularly around preserving affordability, is really important as we also start to build out an understanding of kind of who owns these properties and then, sort of what their motivations might be. But that's, again, sort of separate body of work that we've been doing as well. But just in that context, there was also a question. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'll try and consolidate a couple of these that have come together. About subsidizing affordable small-scale housing. This was asked in the context of historic districts. I don't know how many actually are in historic districts as opposed to like neighborhoods just where we are seeing some values rising. But then also thinking about more intensive use of the existing single-family stock. Are there ways to connect the abundance of oversized, privately owned single-family housing with working people and families for a room or two to more efficiently use shared space, which then gets into the question about sort of accessory dwelling units, zoning challenges, and the like. So I'll open that up for Elizabeth and for Chris if you guys have some thoughts about kind of, again, sort of bringing opportunity to folks into communities and what some of the barriers to doing that might be.
Actually, there was a really interesting program I learned about in Baltimore where a Baltimore housing developer matched senior citizens living in a large home who needed some help with some daily life activities with a young renter who needed an affordable rent. And so they were able to both keep seniors in their homes and offer additional affordable housing opportunities for young people who needed a place to live. So I think that's the kind of holistic thinking we need to be doing more of to try to solve 2 problems at once.
Yeah, and I think that there's an opportunity to. Yeah, sure. The thinking about the sort of development math around what pencils, in trying to build new development. I think we often end up with subsidies and other programs driving us to these larger scale developments. But to the extent that we can figure out more scattered site, mixed stock types of approaches as we build new affordable and new housing stock in these neighborhoods, particularly as we try to penetrate further into sort of single family neighborhoods in a way that, can get the green light in getting built in these communities. I think that's a benefit to getting, again, more of that missing middle type housing, but more scale. Even ADUs is a big step in a lot of these communities, but how can we build on that further with more modest density so that we have range up to those higher, larger scale multifamily projects so that we can get more housing in more types of places.
Yeah, and I'm always struck, and to talk about the missing middle, I'm sort of walking through Los Angeles, which everybody sort of assumes is, just sort of single-family homes as far as the eye can see. But in fact, when you go into most of these neighborhoods, you've got small multifamily properties nestled in amongst the single-family properties, and nobody even notices. So I think in a lot of cases, the kind of the theoretical backlash and perceived degradation of neighborhood, which is not borne out by any of the evidence, by the way, that sort of multifamily kind of brings the neighborhood down is not true, and in fact it can be developed in a neighborhood context at a neighborhood scale as a way to kind of create opportunity in places or access to places with high opportunities. And so with that, I see we've got about a minute left. So I'll use that sort of as a way to kind of tie all of the themes that we've explored in our papers together about investing both in the people and the places and across a variety of different neighborhoods, giving folks opportunity and flexibility. And so with that, I will bring the webinar to a close. Chris and Elizabeth, it's been really great working with you on these papers. Very glad they're now out for public consumption and look forward to ongoing conversations, much like the ones we've had today. As folks kind of take these papers, digest them, certainly welcome feedback. And so thank you to everyone who's on the phone for participating in this webinar. And again, you can learn more and download these papers at enterprisecommunity.org/advancing opportunity through affordable housing, again, with the dashes between each of those words. And so once again, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Elizabeth. And on behalf of my colleagues here at Enterprise, we appreciate you joining us for this webinar.